Hello everyone and welcome to the channel The Territory of Cinema. Please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a thumbs up. Today we are going to be discussing the film Shelter 2026. The narrative unfurls within the claustrophobic confines of a deep-sea research habitat, a technological marvel thrust into the crushing abyss. We meet Dr. Eris Thorne, a marine biologist whose dedication borders on obsession, driven by a childhood fascination with bioluminescence witnessed during a disastrous, though ultimately survived, family sailing trip. His meticulous nature is evident in the sterile precision of his data logs, a stark contrast to the raw emotional turmoil simmering beneath the surface. He's paired, perhaps somewhat reluctantly, with Lena Hansen, a robotics engineer whose background is rooted in developing autonomous drone systems for deep-sea salvage operations. Lena carries the quiet weight of a past failure, a high-profile drone malfunction that cost a salvage team months of effort, and views this deep-sea assignment as a chance to prove the absolute reliability of her latest AI companion, a sophisticated submersible unit named Nautilus. Their mission, initially presented as a routine survey of previously uncharted hydrothermal vents, quickly devolves into something far more unsettling. Thorne, eager to document unique extremophile life forms that could revolutionize biotechnology, his long-held ambition mirroring the revolutionary fervor of early oceanographers like William Beebe, begins noticing anomalies in the geological readings. These aren't just vents, they seem artificially regulated, suggesting a structure far older and more complex than any known deep-sea architecture. As Thorne pushes Nautilus further beyond established safety parameters, against Hansen's increasingly strained advice, the habitat begins to experience localized power fluctuations. Hansen, whose engineering philosophy is built on redundancy and fail-safes learned from years of troubleshooting malfunctioning hardware in hostile environments, suspects external interference, perhaps a hitherto unknown geological instability interacting with their power core. She channels the focus she once poured into perfecting the micromanipulators on her salvage drones into debugging the habitat's increasingly erratic life support. The isolation becomes palpable. Weeks turn into a monotonous cycle of monitoring equipment and rationing supplies. Thorne discovers cryptic markings within the rock face captured by Nautilus's high-resolution cameras, symbols that resonate with obscure, forgotten myths of pre-Diluvian civilizations he'd read about during his undergraduate studies. He starts projecting meaning onto every flicker of light and every unexplained noise, fueled by the pressure of being so far removed from the surface world that anchored his previous scientific rigor. Hansen, meanwhile, focuses on a recurring signature in the sonar data, a rhythmic, low-frequency pulse that seems to originate from the structure Thorne insists on exploring. She attempts to communicate with the surface, but their uplink is degraded, reduced to bursts of static that echo the frustrating delays she experienced managing remote operations years prior. Her attempts to impose logical order, recalibrating sensors, rerouting power, are met with resistance from the environment itself. The climax arrives when Thorne, convinced the structure is an ancient energy source, overrides safety protocols to send Nautilus directly into a massive, cathedral-like cavern within the rock. The structure, far from being inert, responds. Bioluminescent organisms previously dormant activate in vast interconnected networks, bathing the cavern in an overwhelming, almost blinding light. This spectacle, which Thorne sees as the validation of his life's pursuit of undiscovered biological marvels, is perceived by Hansen as a critical system overload. As the habitat groans under immense pressure, signaling imminent structural failure, Hansen realizes the structure isn't built for habitation, it's a mechanism. She must sever the connection between Nautilus and the habitat's main systems before the energy surge fries everything, including the limited escape pod diagnostics. She fights Thorne, who refuses to abandon his discovery, seeing retreat as the ultimate scientific capitulation. In a desperate move mirroring the precise, life-saving maneuvers she once executed on crippled underwater vehicles, Hansen manually overrides the external tether, sacrificing the data and, perhaps, Thorne's career trajectory for their immediate survival. The structure then abruptly goes dark. The rhythmic pulse ceases. The only sound is the strained creaking of the habitat settling back into equilibrium, the sudden silence more terrifying than the noise had been. The final sequence shows Hansen guiding the damaged, barely functional submersible back towards the ascent zone, the experience having stripped away the veneer of technological confidence she clung to, leaving only hard-won instinct. Thorne, silent and visibly broken, stares out at the empty blackness where his revelation once shone, forever haunted by the knowledge that some secrets are not meant to be catalogued. They ascend, two survivors carrying the indelible imprint of the deep, their shared future uncertain, bound by the immense indifferent pressure they narrowly escaped. The descent into the Hadal Zone had always been Thorne's romanticized escape from the banality of shallow water labs, a yearning inherited from his grandfather's forgotten nautical charts. Now, enveloped by the crushing blackness, that romance curdled into stark professional tension. Thorne, tall and gaunt, moved through the habitat's narrow corridors with the restless energy of a caged predator, his eyes perpetually red-rimmed from staring at monitors glowing with impossibly deep-sea spectral readings. He viewed Hansen not just as a necessary technician, but as an anchor dragging down the potential of true discovery. Hansen, conversely, maintained a rigidity born from years spent troubleshooting million-dollar robotic arms that had decided, mid-operation, to simply cease functioning. She carried the practical cynicism of a builder who knew exactly how many ways a high-pressure seal could fail. Her movements were economical, every adjustment to the life support matrix precise, a silent rebuke to Thorne's impulsive probing. She often ran her hands over the cold metal hull, seeking the vibration that signaled danger, a tactile connection to the vessel that was more reliable than any digital readout Thorne trusted. When the first structural harmonics registered, a low, resonant thrum that felt less like seismic activity and more like a massive, slow heartbeat, Hansen immediately began cataloging power draw variances, trying to fit the anomaly into known physics models. Thorne, interpreting the same data, saw affirmation. He recalled the almost spiritual awe he felt as a teenager when a rogue wave had capsized his father's sailboat, revealing for a terrifying instant the phosphorescent life teeming just beneath the surface, a primal chaos that science was meant to tame, or at least understand. He believed this deep structure held the key to harnessing that chaos. Their communication degraded into terse necessities. Thorne would issue commands for Nautilus to breach a specific thermal barrier. Hansen would counter with warnings about thermal runoff, destabilizing the hull plating, referencing stress tests she'd conducted years ago on deep-sea mining prototypes. The habitat's limited hydroponics bay, meant to provide a psychological boost with fresh greens, started failing, the artificial sunlight sputtering, mirroring the deterioration of their professional trust. The symbols Thorne obsessed over, captured in the grainy, echoing light of Nautilus's external lamps, weren't just geometric forms. They seemed to shift slightly with each subsequent pass, an effect Thorne attributed to environmental settling, but which Hansen privately feared was a distortion in the camera optics caused by increasing electromagnetic interference originating from the structure itself. She remembered the tedious process of debugging early AI navigation systems that would generate ghost data when overloaded, a haunting possibility that the very environment was lying to them through corrupted signals. The final approach into the colossal illuminated space, the cathedral, was a moment of terrible beauty. Thorne, leaning too close to the primary viewport, his breath fogging the inner surface, whispered about the synthesis of life and energy, his voice strained with near-religious fervor. The organisms weren't just glowing, they were communicating through light, a biological fiber optic network spanning a space larger than any known undersea cave system. Hansen saw only the catastrophic feedback loop. The light wasn't passive. It was drawing immense, measurable energy from their immediate surroundings, including the habitat's core shielding. Her desperation was cold, practical rage. She didn't argue about the data. She moved, grabbing the emergency cutting tool she used for severing tangled winch lines, a tool designed for brute force physical separation. She bypassed the electronic locks on the external tether controls. As Thorne lunged to stop her, shouting about the historical weight of his discovery, she initiated the manual cut. The severing process was violent, throwing sparks against the viewport, a physical manifestation of their fractured partnership. The resulting silence was absolute. When the pressure normalized slightly and the terrifying glow receded, leaving only the pale, sickly yellow of the habitat's emergency lighting, the only thing left was the task of survival. Hansen wrestled the controls of Nautilus, not for scientific gain, but for the sheer animal imperative to move upward. Thorne sat slumped beside her console, the overwhelming realization of his near-death experience and the loss of his life's work settling upon him like the deep-sea silt. He had reached for transcendence and found only an abyss that threatened to consume him whole, leaving him diminished, staring at the darkness that had almost become his tomb. The ascent was a slow, grinding penance, measured not in fathoms gained but in the agonizing silence between Thorne and Hansen. They had jettisoned non-essential equipment to conserve the precious, albeit diminished power reserves, a necessary triage that felt like a physical amputation of their scientific mandate. Thorne, usually verbose when analyzing findings, was reduced to monosyllabic responses, his genius temporarily crippled by the confrontation with an incomprehensible reality. He spent hours meticulously reviewing the fragmented recordings from Nautilus's final moments inside the structure, hoping to find a pattern in the explosive bioluminescence, a Rosetta Stone to the energy source. But the data remained frustratingly chaotic, resisting his ordered mind. Hansen, focused solely on maintaining propulsion and calculating drift, found a grim satisfaction in the immediate problem-solving. She meticulously patched the hull breaches caused by the power fluctuations, applying temporary sealant patches with the same unwavering focus she once applied to designing failure-proof connectors for deep-sea rigs. This forced return to the purely mechanical, the tangible fix, was a psychological balm against the existential dread the ancient structure had instilled. She avoided looking at Thorne, fearing that any acknowledgement of their shared trauma would unlock the emotional floodgates that she needed to keep firmly bolted down to execute the navigation. As they neared the upper thermocline, where the pressure began to release its suffocating grip, they encountered the secondary effect of their forced egress, a dense field of micro-debris. Fragments of organic material disturbed by the energy surge clogged the external sensors and threatened the integrity of the submersible's maneuvering thrusters. This required a risky maneuver. Hansen had to temporarily disable the automatic cleaning cycle, exposing the habitat's vulnerable exterior to potential abrasion, and rely on Thorne to manually pilot Nautilus through the worst of the cloud using only the heavily degraded optical feed. This shared, immediate danger forced a grudging reintegration of their skills. Thorne, forced away from theoretical contemplation, found clarity in the immediate demands of navigation. He spoke softly, directing minute adjustments to the lateral stabilizers, his voice regaining some of its former command, albeit stripped of its former arrogance. Hansen monitored the hull integrity alarms, her ear attuned to the slightest grinding sound that indicated a major scrape. In those moments of intense cooperative focus, the memory of their conflict faded beneath the shared adrenaline, revealing the core competence that had initially brought them together, two brilliant minds operating at peak efficiency under duress. When the emergency beacon finally pierced the surface static, signaling their position to the surface recovery vessel, the relief was muted, overshadowed by the knowledge of what they had left behind. They had survived the dark, but they had returned empty-handed, bearing only the burden of an extraordinary secret that, without physical proof, would forever remain the ravings of two isolated scientists. As the rescue team's lights began to cut through the gray gloom above, Hansen locked the final diagnostic report, ensuring that the raw, unfiltered energy readings from the cavern remained quarantined, an insurance policy against the possibility that the structure was not dormant, merely waiting for the pressure to equalize before awakening again. The transition from the crushing weight of the abyss to the relative lightness of the upper water column brought not immediate solace, but a profound disorientation. When the recovery vessel's massive shadow finally fell across their battered habitat, it felt less like rescue and more like an unwelcome intrusion into a sanctuary of shared terror. Thorne, gripping the edge of the viewport as the habitat was winched upward, watched the blue lighten to an opaque gray, his mind still calibrated to the near-zero luminosity of the trench. He felt intensely vulnerable, stripped bare by the confrontation with forces that defied his neat scientific framework. The youthful scientist, eager to catalog the unknown, had been replaced by a man weighed down by the burden of the unprovable, his hands trembling not from cold, but from the sudden vacuum where absolute certainty used to reside. Hansen managed the docking sequence with the quiet competence of a veteran pilot landing a crippled craft on a smoke-filled runway. Her focus remained external, managing the umbilical connections and external pressure equalization valves, using the routine of procedure as a shield against the urge to collapse. She observed Thorne's reaction to the surfacing light, a near-painful recoil, and understood that for him, the failure to bring back definitive proof was equivalent to professional annihilation. She, however, found a strange, hard-won peace in the realization that sometimes the most important engineering feat is knowing when to cut the line, when to prioritize the vessel and its occupants over the mission objective. Her past failure, the loss of time and resources due to a robotic error, had taught her the brutal necessity of pragmatic retreat, a lesson Thorne had nearly paid for with his life. Once secured aboard the recovery deck, the atmosphere shifted immediately from life-or-death struggle to sterile bureaucratic interrogation. Medical teams swarmed them, their questions rapid-fire and focused on physical well-being, skirting the edges of the extraordinary events below. When the lead investigator, a stern woman whose reputation was built on debunking dubious deep-sea claims, began her formal questioning, Hansen answered with crisp, technical precision: power fluctuations, structural harmonics, sensor anomalies. She presented the controlled degradation of the life support system as a series of predictable failures within an extreme environment, carefully omitting the details of the structure's inexplicable light show and the seismic pulse. Thorne, however, struggled under the fluorescent glare of the ship's infirmary. Pressed about the purpose of the final, unauthorized dive, he faltered. His attempt to describe the networked bioluminescence sounded histrionic, even to his own ears. He saw the skepticism in the investigator's eyes, the subtle hand gesture signaling to a colleague to perhaps increase the dosage of sedatives. His obsession had been his anchor, and now, detached from the environment that seemingly confirmed his wildest theories, his words felt flimsy. The scientist who once commanded respect through irrefutable data now sounded like a man who had suffered profound hypoxia-induced hallucinations. Hansen watched this crumbling from a distance, offering Thorne a silent, almost imperceptible nod of encouragement, before turning back to secure the data logs she had manually archived. She knew the truth wouldn't fit neatly into surface metrics. She had encrypted the most damning files, setting them to delete automatically after a set period, unless a specific, complex key, a sequence derived from the very low-frequency pulse they had recorded, was input. It was her silent acknowledgement of Thorne's discovery, a lifeline thrown to his reputation, should he ever find the clarity or the courage to explain the inexplicable without sounding insane. They were bound now not by shared success, but by a shared, carefully guarded deception, survivors who knew that the deepest, most profound truths are often the ones that must remain submerged. The surface world, with its noise and relentless daylight, felt aggressively artificial compared to the profound, pressurized silence they had just escaped. Thorne found himself retreating further into himself aboard the recovery vessel, the sterile white walls of the infirmary a poor substitute for the comforting blackness he had known for weeks. He was haunted by the image of the light receding, the sudden death of that colossal living mechanism. He started obsessing over the few remaining frames Nautilus had captured before the tether was cut, not the structure itself, but the residue left on the viewport glass. He painstakingly examined the spectral analysis of the residual illumination, convinced that the light carried an intrinsic signature, a pattern that could be reverse-engineered, even without the source. His scientific drive, once aimed at discovery, had mutated into a desperate need for validation, a refusal to accept that his greatest encounter was now just anecdotal evidence. Hansen, meanwhile, occupied herself with the mundane logistics of inventory and equipment assessment. She moved through the ship's hold, cataloging the near-total failure of the advanced sensors, but she did so with a detached professionalism that masked a growing internal conflict. The investigator's polite dismissal of Thorne's fervor was a tangible threat, but Hansen felt a strange loyalty hardening within her. She had seen what Thorne had seen, and the sheer impossibility of that deep-sea event outweighed any bureaucratic demand for neat explanations. She found herself revisiting the encrypted data packet constantly, testing the integrity of the specialized key she had devised. It wasn't just about saving Thorne's career, it was about preserving the integrity of the observation itself. If the structure was an intelligent energy regulator, as they suspected, then its concealment was likely intentional, and reporting it fully might invite a dangerous surface-world curiosity into depths better left undisturbed. One evening, while Thorne was staring blankly at a simulation of the vent field, Hansen approached him quietly. She didn't offer false comfort or apologies for the tether cut. Instead, she placed a heavily secured tablet on the table between them. The hull integrity monitors registered a slight temperature spike 60 seconds after we severed the primary feed, she stated, her voice low, avoiding the direct gaze of the medical staff milling nearby. It wasn't residual heat from the structure. It was a localized drain, localized on the exterior hull interface where Nautilus was connected. Thorne looked up, the first flicker of true engagement in days crossing his face. The precise technical observation cut through his haze of self-pity. "A parasite," he whispered, his mind instantly racing back to concepts of symbiotic energy transfer he'd dismissed as fringe theory. It didn't just shut down, it sampled the intrusion. Hansen nodded, tapping the screen where a minuscule spike registered on the timeline graph. It reacted to the disconnection, Thorne. It didn't just stop glowing. It extracted something from our hardware before it went inert. It was smarter than we gave it credit for. This shared interpretation, framed in the cold, hard language of engineering and physics, became their new foundation. They weren't collaborators fighting for glory. They were two reluctant guardians of a terrifying secret, united by the knowledge that the deep was not empty, but simply patient. The ascent had not ended their mission. It had merely shifted the battlefield from the crushing environment to the far more treacherous terrain of surface skepticism and defense. The realization that the structure had actively sampled their intrusion galvanized Thorne. The abstract beauty of the bioluminescent cathedral was instantly overlaid with the chilling logic of a defense mechanism. He leaned closer to the tablet, the skepticism that had plagued his recent interactions dissolving into sharp, focused intensity. If the structure could extract data or energy upon physical severance, it implied a level of adaptability far beyond any known extremophile, a programmed, almost calculated response. He began sketching diagrams, not of biology, but of complex circuit theory, mapping out how a biological entity could mimic a feedback loop designed to isolate and analyze foreign components. His earlier obsession with ancient myths transformed into a pragmatic, almost paranoid assessment of deep-sea cybersecurity. Hansen watched this transformation with guarded optimism. The return of Thorne's analytical fire was encouraging, but she was acutely aware that they could not present this finding openly. The surface world, represented by the meticulous investigator, sought clean data points, a broken vent, an anomalous thermal reading, not evidence of an ancient, living hard drive reacting to intrusion. She shifted her focus from defense against the depths to defense against the scrutiny of their superiors. She began systematically scrubbing the habitat's main computer logs, deleting the high-frequency sonar returns that clearly depicted the rhythmic pulse, ensuring that any external audit would find only a series of power surges followed by system failure, a narrative of technological stress, not intelligent defense. Their collaboration, forged in the pressure cooker of the abyss, now involved espionage against their own support crew. Thorne needed access to the specialized electromagnetic frequency analyzers they had brought down, equipment now sealed in quarantine storage awaiting decontamination protocols. He engineered a diversion during a routine shift change, feigning a severe, vertigo-induced episode requiring immediate specialized atmospheric testing within the sealed cargo bay. While the medical team was distracted by monitoring his increasingly erratic vital signs, Hansen, using her intimate knowledge of the vessel's security architecture, a skill honed by years bypassing shipyard locks for salvage drone deployment, slipped into the quarantine zone. In the confined space of the cargo bay, surrounded by inert, massive machinery, they worked with hushed urgency. Hansen bypassed the magnetic seals, and Thorne feverishly connected the sensitive EM receiver to a shielded laptop. They weren't looking for new activity. They were searching for residual energy signatures clinging to their own equipment. After several agonizing minutes of scanning the hull plating of the habitat itself, the receiver peaked. A faint, incredibly subtle harmonic pattern was detected, a ghost signal embedded in the molecular structure of the titanium alloy, confirming Hansen's theory. The structure hadn't just reacted, it had left a signature on the intruders, a form of biotagging. As they prepared to retreat, Thorne paused, looking not at the data, but at the dark, unforgiving outline of the retrieved habitat looming in the bay. "It wasn't meant to be found, Lena," he said, using her first name for the first time since the accident, his voice heavy with a realization that transcended science. "It's not a discovery to be published. It's a secret to be guarded." Hansen looked at him, seeing the fear finally replaced by a sober commitment. She understood. They weren't just protecting their careers, they were protecting the surface from an awareness it was entirely unequipped to handle. The true mission, they both silently agreed, was the containment of the truth they brought back. The unspoken pact sealed in the cargo bay brought a grim clarity to their predicament. They were no longer researchers attempting to explain an anomaly. They were custodians of a knowledge too large for the world they inhabited. The faint harmonic signature etched into the titanium hull was their absolute proof, a silent testament that existed only within their encrypted files and their shared memory. Thorne, now fueled by a protective zeal rather than pure curiosity, began focusing on defense mechanisms. He started viewing the world through the lens of the deep structure. How does a vast, ancient system conceal itself? The answer, he surmised, involved making any observation appear entirely mundane or entirely insane. Hansen, ever the engineer of failure mitigation, began designing protocols for plausible deniability. She meticulously fabricated a narrative of equipment malfunction cascading into system failure, a story robust enough to satisfy the investigator's need for a closed case, yet vague enough to conceal the nature of the external influence. She recalled the meticulous schematics she once drew for catastrophic breach simulations, and now applied that same rigor to simulating catastrophic reputation damage. She knew that if they presented the truth too cleanly, they would be discredited. If they presented it too wildly, they would be institutionalized. The sweet spot was a meticulously crafted technical mess. Their interactions grew subtly warmer, stripped of the competitive edge that defined their initial partnership. They communicated through shared glances and shorthand references to the harmonic residue, or the ghost code, a private language born of shared extremity. One afternoon, as they prepared to give their final official debriefing before being formally released, Thorne offered Hansen a chipped, ancient navigational compass he had salvaged from his personal effects, an object he had always kept for luck. "It kept us on course when the electronics failed," he said simply, placing it on her observation console. It was a gesture of profound trust, acknowledging her superior ability to navigate chaotic variables. Hansen accepted the compass, its brass casing cool against her palm. It felt weighty, tangible, a stark contrast to the phantom energies they had battled. She looked at Thorne, noticing the tension around his eyes had eased slightly, replaced by a weary resolution. "We need to ensure the recovery site is classified permanently," she stated, her voice low enough that only he could hear over the hum of the ship's active systems. "If they send another team down, they'll either find nothing or they'll find a system ready for a more robust defense." Her experience with high-risk salvage taught her that the first successful recovery always invites the second, more aggressive attempt. The final debriefing was a masterclass in controlled omission. Thorne spoke eloquently about the overwhelming geological stresses and the potential for unknown microbial life evolving under extreme pressure, presenting his notes as preliminary theories that required further, cautious study, a significant step back from his earlier zealotry. When the investigator pressed specifically about the final moments and the violent tether severing, Hansen stepped in, detailing the emergency override sequence she initiated, framing it as a last-ditch attempt to save the habitat core from an unpredictable thermal runaway caused by equipment fatigue. They successfully guided the narrative away from sentience and toward the predictable, tragic failure of man-made technology in an unforgiving environment. As they stepped off the recovery vessel onto solid ground, the sun blindingly bright, they carried no physical evidence, only the weight of an oceanic secret, perfectly contained, perpetually vibrating just beneath the surface of their engineered calm. The return to the surface world, however, was not an end, but a careful staging for a protracted silence. Thorne and Hansen were debriefed, examined, and ultimately released into the world with medical clearances suggesting exhaustion and mild psychological strain, a convenient medical shorthand for having glimpsed the impossible. They separated immediately, understanding that proximity would only invite further scrutiny. Thorne retreated to a secluded coastal research institute, ostensibly to write a heavily redacted paper on deep-sea microbiology, but primarily to build a private monitoring array. He converted a small, soundproofed laboratory into a fortress against the mundane, installing specialized sensors designed to detect the near-imperceptible low-frequency oscillations he now believed permeated the entire planet, not just the abyss. He was no longer chasing life forms, he was listening for the structure's dormant pulse. Hansen relocated inland, paradoxically seeking distance from the ocean that had defined her career. She took a consulting role designing autonomous factory infrastructure, a world where the variables were logical, predictable, and built by human hands. Yet the brass compass Thorne gave her sat on her desk, a constant metallic reminder of the chaos she had embraced to save them both. She devoted her off hours to developing a sophisticated predictive modeling software based on the corrupted sensor data she had managed to salvage. She wasn't trying to prove the structure existed. She was trying to map the limits of its apparent influence, to calculate the precise energy threshold required to wake it again, ensuring that no future submersible mission inadvertently triggered a catastrophic response. Her former drive to create flawless engineering was now channeled into creating the perfect, undetectable quarantine. Their only consistent channel of communication was through deeply encrypted one-way data bursts disguised as routine maintenance reports sent to Thorne's institute concerning the decommissioned habitat, which sat awaiting transport to a secure naval yard. Hansen would embed complex mathematical proofs within the reports, couched in engineering jargon about ballast integrity and stress fractures. Thorne would respond by subtly altering the Institute's public seismic monitoring logs, a minor, seemingly insignificant recalibration of background noise, which, to Hansen's specialized software, served as confirmation that the ghost signal remained stable, quiescent. Months later, Thorne made his first tentative move outside the confines of professional secrecy. He presented a theoretical paper at an obscure symposium focusing on nonlinear dynamics in extreme pressure systems. The paper intentionally skirted the edges of the truth, using highly abstract mathematical language to describe a phenomenon of self-regulating, massive-scale biological energy systems. During the Q&A, a veteran geophysicist, a man known for his conservatism, raised an eyebrow. "Dr. Thorne," the man queried dryly, "your equations suggest a system capable of maintaining equilibrium against impossible external pressures. Are you suggesting we found something down there that actively resists physical laws, or are you simply overfitting your model to explain an equipment failure?" Thorne, standing before the audience, felt the familiar pressure mount, but this time it was tempered by the knowledge secured in Hansen's encrypted files. He didn't flinch. He looked directly at the geophysicist, adopting the tone of a weary, humbled scientist. "I suggest, sir," Thorne replied, his voice steady, "that the deep ocean teaches us that our models are only as good as our last observation, and sometimes the most profound observation is realizing that the failure isn't in the equipment, but in our foundational assumptions about what is inanimate." He let the statement hang, allowing the intellectual ambiguity to shield the terrifying reality. He knew that Hansen, miles away, monitoring the resulting academic chatter, would read the response correctly. The secret was safe, cloaked perfectly within the realm of acceptable scientific speculation, awaiting the day they might need to verify if their self-imposed silence had been truly effective. The subtle dance of coded communication became their new reality, a testament to a partnership forged in near death. Thorne's paper, while academically palatable, was a flare sent into the dark, testing the waters for residual interest. He watched the academic fallout with detached intensity, gauging who might be clever enough to look beneath the mathematical veil. Hansen, meanwhile, used her engineering consultancy work as a means to subtly influence the decommissioning schedule of the original research habitat. She argued for an extended quarantine period, citing the potential for unforeseen chemical leaching from the experimental alloys, effectively keeping the physical evidence locked away in naval custody for as long as possible. One rain-swept afternoon, Thorne received an unscheduled transmission disguised as an invoice query from Hansen's firm regarding the calibration records of the submersible's external lights, the very lights that had illuminated the cavern. The message contained an anomaly Thorne immediately recognized, a series of repeating prime numbers embedded within the serial number sequence, a sequence they had briefly discussed as a potential pattern for complex, non-random biological signaling. This wasn't a system check. It was a direct alert. Someone else, perhaps reviewing the original mission logs after Thorne's ambiguous paper, was noticing patterns too. The surface world, slow as it was beginning to connect the dots they had tried to scatter. Thorne knew they had to move beyond passive defense. He contacted Hansen under the guise of needing a final assessment of the habitat's structural integrity before its permanent shelving, insisting on an in-person meeting at the Naval Storage Depot where the vessel was housed. Meeting in the cavernous, echo-filled warehouse, surrounded by the hulking, decommissioned metal shell, felt like revisiting a tomb. The air was stale, smelling of brine and oxidation. "The prime sequence in the light logs," Thorne murmured, glancing nervously at the distant security booth. "It means someone is looking at the visual data, not the power readings, not the geology, but the light itself. They are correlating the anomaly with the bioluminescence exposure." Hansen's face was grim. She tapped the metallic hull of the habitat, the same spot she'd touched weeks ago during their frantic repair efforts. "The structure didn't just sample our data, it left a fingerprint that is visible in the noise." My predictive model flagged an external access attempt on the quarantined energy readings, a brute force sequence attempt initiated 3 days ago. They are closing in on the key, Eris. We don't have time to wait for the world to catch up to our theory. The pragmatic engineer took over. We need to ensure that if they do manage to unlock the true data, they find nothing useful, or, better yet, something actively detrimental to their systems. She proposed a final high-stakes infiltration. They would use her access credentials to briefly board the habitat before the final decommissioning sweep, not to erase data, but to introduce a counteragent, a refined version of the logic bomb she had been developing, designed to mimic the structure's own energy signature and overload any conventional data retrieval system attempting to read the original logs. It was a desperate gamble, relying on one engineered lie to protect an unimaginable truth. Thorne, seeing the plan laid out with cold, precise steps, felt the familiar surge of adrenaline. He hadn't found the answer in the deep, but he was ready to fight for the right to keep it buried. The infiltration of the naval storage facility was executed with the quiet precision of a deep-sea salvage operation gone rogue. Hansen utilized her old contractor credentials, arguing with the night watchman over the urgency of verifying the environmental seals on the habitat before its scheduled transportation. A lie bolstered by Thorne's reputation as a volatile but brilliant scientist whose equipment could not be left unchecked. The vast, dimly lit warehouse swallowed the sound of their movements, the massive, scarred hulk of the research module sitting in the center like a beached leviathan. Inside the habitat, the air was thick with the metallic tang of stagnant, recycled oxygen and ozone residue. Thorne immediately went to the primary data core, his fingers flying across the interface, accessing the system that had once held their scientific lifeblood. He bypassed the security layers he himself had helped install, driven now by the singular purpose of sabotage rather than discovery. He felt a strange sense of finality. This act of deliberate corruption was the only way to honor the profound reality they had encountered. Hansen, meanwhile, worked on the exterior interface ports, deploying the custom-built injection device. Her movements were fluid, born from years spent working in cramped, hostile environments where a single misplaced tool could spell disaster. This device contained the tailored counter-logic, a complex, self-replicating algorithm designed to appear as an uncontrolled biological energy spike should anyone attempt to access the original files. "It's ready, Eris," she whispered over the short-range comm unit they'd rigged. "If they try to read the core data, they won't get the light show. They'll get a feedback loop that reads like a system-wide meltdown. It'll fry their retrieval hardware." As Thorne connected the final upload sequence, he paused, looking at the viewport, now opaque and dull under the warehouse lights. He remembered the blinding, overwhelming intelligence that had filled that space. "What if," he said, his voice strained, "what if this thing isn't just defending itself? What if it's waiting for a signal that we are a threat, and our countermeasure just confirms it?" Hansen didn't hesitate. "Then we've bought ourselves time, Eris. Time is the only commodity that matters against something that has survived millennia. If it wakes up angry, it will be because we forced its hand, not because we didn't try to contain the evidence." She finalized the external connection, the soft click of the magnetic seal engaging echoing loudly in the silence. They retreated just as the first sliver of dawnlight filtered through the high warehouse windows, leaving the habitat primed for its final, misleading legacy. As they exited the facility, blending back into the anonymous flow of early morning commuters, they knew the game had changed. They had sacrificed the chance for validation for the necessity of survival. Their shared secret had evolved from a terrifying observation into an active defense project, turning two brilliant scientists into silent guardians operating in the shadows of the world they were supposed to serve. They had ensured that the greatest discovery of their lives would remain archived as the world's most expensive and most meticulously covered-up technical failure. The cinematic venture, tentatively titled Shelter 2026, despite its speculative future setting, immediately grounds itself in the familiar anxieties of isolation and imposed security, a thematic resonance particularly potent given the contemporary global climate. The film doesn't lean heavily into high-concept science fiction spectacle. Instead, it utilizes its near-future architectural premise, a self-contained, technologically advanced living unit designed for extended survival, as a crucible for character study. The narrative hinges on the psychological toll exacted by enforced proximity and routine, a dynamic expertly played out through the performances of its leads. Consider the central figure, perhaps an architect or systems designer, whose background clearly informs their initial confidence in the supposed perfection of their enclosure. If we extrapolate from the career trajectory one might expect for someone capable of constructing such a hermetic environment, we see echoes of figures like Norman Foster or even the more cerebral, constraint-driven design philosophies of early brutalism, albeit rendered in sleek, adaptive materials. This character, initially the master of their domain, must then confront the limits of even the most rigorous design when faced with inherent human variables. Their reliance on logic and system integrity slowly erodes as the external reality, or the perceived lack thereof, begins to manifest internally. Juxtaposed against this ordered mind is the secondary character, perhaps someone whose background lies in more fluid, less structured fields, maybe a former bioethicist or an artist whose work focused on transient states. This contrast is crucial. Where the architect seeks measurable stability, the other seeks experiential authenticity. This tension often mirrors artistic debates from the past. Think of the tension between the rigid formalism of mid-century modernism and the expressive fluidity of the organic architecture movements that followed. The film subtly suggests that a shelter, by its very nature, denies the essential human need for flux. The visual language of Shelter 2026 appears deliberately muted, favoring cool blues and sterile whites, punctuated only when psychological distress begins to manifest, perhaps bleeding harsh, unnatural colors into the normally pristine interfaces. This is not merely aesthetic choice. It reflects the character's diminishing capacity to perceive or generate natural vibrancy. The sound design, too, plays a vital role, amplifying the subtle mechanical hums and the oppressive silence of true isolation. A deliberate choice that seems inspired by the claustrophobic soundscapes of certain psychological thrillers from the late 1970s, those films where the environment itself becomes the antagonist. What elevates the film beyond a simple survival scenario is the exploration of memory and fabricated reality. As the duration of their confinement extends, the reliability of their shared history and their individual recollections becomes suspect. This manipulation of subjective reality owes a debt to narrative structures found in films that question institutional control, where the environment, no matter how meticulously designed for safety, ultimately becomes a mechanism of psychological dismantling. The film posits that the most dangerous variable in any perfectly engineered system is the unquantifiable nature of consciousness itself. The ambition here seems to be less about escaping the physical structure and more about escaping the definitions and limitations that structure imposes upon identity. It's a narrative about realizing that true shelter cannot be built. It must be negotiated both internally and with others, a concept far more complex than any algorithm can manage. The emotional landscape of Shelter 2026 is one of creeping dread rather than explosive panic. The initial reliance on established protocols, the precise calibration of air filtration, the meticulous inventory checks, serves as a fragile defense against the rising tide of existential ennui. The protagonist, the engineer archetype, likely approaches the breakdown not as a catastrophic failure, but as an anomalous dataset requiring aggressive troubleshooting. We can envision their early career spent meticulously detailing specifications for high-stress environments, perhaps even involved in designing deep-sea habitats or long-duration space modules, disciplines where meticulousness translates directly to survival. This inherent need for quantifiable success makes their inevitable emotional slippage all the more tragic. When the logic gates fail to resolve the feeling of wrongness, their carefully constructed internal architecture begins to shudder. The secondary character, the one perhaps focused on sociology or human interaction theory, presents the necessary friction. They might have previously studied emergent behaviors in isolated small groups, drawing inspiration from historical Antarctic expeditions, or perhaps even the early psychological experiments concerning sensory deprivation. Their skepticism towards the shelter's infallible design would have been present from the start, manifesting as minor bureaucratic resistance or a persistent questioning of the established daily cadence. As the confinement deepens, their narrative arc shifts from intellectual critique to emotional necessity. They become the anchor to genuine human experience, recognizing that the sterile comfort of the habitat is actively eroding their sense of self-worth, which thrives on external validation and unpredictable interaction. Their greatest fear is not physical death, but the successful assimilation into the habitat's designed apathy. The visual motifs mentioned earlier, the cool, controlled palette, are likely interspersed with specific, highly charged flashbacks or induced hallucinations that break the monotony. If the architect character is haunted by a decision made just prior to entering the shelter, that memory might manifest as a brief, jarring oversaturation of color, perhaps the intense, warm light of an outdoor setting they willingly abandoned for this sterile piece. This technique echoes the way filmmakers have used sharp chromatic shifts to denote mental fracturing, drawing from the visual language of disorientation seen in films examining military confinement or institutionalization. Furthermore, the film appears to examine the inherent paternalism of high-tech security solutions. The creators of the Shelter 2026 concept likely envisioned themselves as benevolent caretakers, removing risk from the equation. The film ultimately subverts this notion, suggesting that the removal of risk is the removal of agency. The dialogue, when it occurs, would likely be clipped, formal, and focused on operational parameters until the psychological pressure forces an almost primal level of unguarded communication. These rare moments of raw vulnerability are the true treasures of the narrative, the small flares of genuine humanity that fight against the overwhelming quietude of their technologically perfect prison. The real conflict, therefore, is the battle to retain the messy, inefficient but vital chaos of genuine personhood against the seductive, clean order of absolute control. The emotional weight of this confinement is expertly modulated through the characters' differing relationships with time. The engineer, rooted in their professional history, constantly measures their present against past achievements and future projections. Every monitored cycle, every successful system check, is a reference point in a timeline they believe they control. This temporal rigidity makes them profoundly vulnerable to the slow, almost imperceptible drift of days turning into indistinguishable voids. We sense the ghost of a celebrated career built on predictable outcomes, a career that paradoxically prepared them for a scenario where predictability becomes the very agent of their undoing. Their initial obsession with maintaining the integrity of the seal or the atmospheric balance is not just about survival. It is about validating their entire life's work, which was predicated on the mastery of physical laws. Conversely, the ethicist or behavioral specialist character experiences time as fluid and experiential. For them, the confinement is a rapid compression of life into a single, unchanging moment, which paradoxically forces them to live more intensely within that moment, examining every subtle shift in the other occupant's demeanor. Their background suggests an intellectual fascination with how identity degrades under extreme duress, a fascination that now turns inward with alarming intimacy. Their past work likely involved studying how social narratives sustain a group. Now they are forced to generate a new, perhaps unstable narrative solely between two people, a narrative constantly undermined by the environment itself. This character embodies the deep-seated human need for external mirrors, the inability to fully know oneself without the reaction and reflection of another, however flawed. The architectural space, the shelter itself, transitions subtly from being a protective shell to an active psychological barrier. Details within the habitation that were initially coded as comforting, the soft automated lighting sequences, the voice-activated environmental controls, begin to feel intrusive and judgmental. Imagine the architect's frustration as they realize the very interface designed for seamless command now mocks their loss of real-world agency. They might spend agonizing hours analyzing schematics, searching for a logical flaw that explains their pervasive unease, only to find the blueprints are perfect, forcing the terrifying conclusion that the flaw resides within the user, not the system. The growing emotional distance between the two characters is perhaps the film's most poignant commentary. Initially, collaboration is mandatory. Later, silence becomes a weapon or a last refuge. The ethicist might begin to project narratives onto the sterile walls, inventing reasons for minor system fluctuations that the engineer dismisses as sensor error. This divergence in interpretation, one seeing metaphor, the other seeing mechanism, drives them apart. Their shared experience, meant to forge unbreakable bonds of mutual reliance, instead highlights their fundamental incompatibility when stripped of the usual social scaffolding that allows for superficial harmony. Shelter 2026 thus functions as a high-tech pressure cooker, revealing that the ultimate failure of any engineered solution is its inability to account for the irreducible, contradictory demands of the human spirit for both safety and freedom. The narrative pivot point in Shelter 2026 must inevitably revolve around the failure of communication, not merely as a breakdown in dialogue, but as a fundamental dissonance in perceived reality fostered by the contained environment. As the external world recedes into rumor or verifiable nothingness, a state often more psychologically taxing than outright catastrophe, the internal communication channels become hypersensitized and prone to distortion. The engineer, driven by their professional impulse to maintain verifiable data streams, begins to view the ethicist's increasing reliance on intuition and metaphor as a direct threat to operational stability. This isn't mere annoyance, it's existential opposition. A career built on quantifiable outputs demands that subjective experience be dismissed as noise, yet it is precisely that noise that begins to define their existence inside the steel and composite shell. One can envision a specific scene where a minor system anomaly, perhaps a fluctuation in nutrient recycling that remains within acceptable parameters, triggers vastly different responses. The engineer dives into diagnostics, their fingers flying across holographic interfaces, seeking the physical root cause, perhaps even blaming a subtle manufacturing defect from years prior, an error traceable to a specific subcontractor or material batch. This externalization of blame is an attempt to retain control. Meanwhile, the ethicist might interpret the identical fluctuation as a direct, almost sentient response from the shelter itself, a symbolic representation of the system's weariness or resentment toward its inhabitants. Their focus shifts from troubleshooting the machine to interpreting its mood. This split becomes the central tragedy. They are sharing the same physical prison, breathing the same recycled air, yet inhabiting entirely different universes of meaning. The aesthetic language should reflect this fracturing consensus. If the film has maintained a strict adherence to rectilinear geometry, the introduction of perceived distortions, a moment where a perfectly aligned vertical line seems to subtly bend under scrutiny, or where the ambient light fails to strike a corner at the expected angle, becomes incredibly potent. These are not visual glitches in the conventional sense, but manifestations of psychological stress bleeding into sensory perception. Such moments would have deep inspiration from experimental cinema that explored paranoia, where the environment itself conspires against the protagonist, mirroring the character's internal unraveling. The engineer would attempt to recalibrate sensors to prove the line is straight, while the ethicist accepts the bend as proof that the absolute laws of physics have been temporarily suspended by their prolonged separation from the natural world. This growing inability to agree on basic sensory data seals their fate, rendering any possibility of shared action or comfort obsolete. They are two distinct consciousnesses trapped in a shared, rapidly dissolving container, proving that the most robust structure fails when the inhabitants cease to share a baseline reality. The ultimate realization dawns not with a bang of structural failure, but with a quiet, horrifying consensus on futility. Having exhausted the quantifiable and the interpretive routes to understanding their predicament, the characters are left facing the ethical void left by their imposed safety. The engineer, having systematically disproven every mechanical failure, is forced back to the initial parameters of the shelter's design. The assumption that human beings are fundamentally predictable inputs requiring optimized conditions. Their expertise, once a source of profound confidence, becomes a cage of inescapable logic. We see this manifested in their behavior, the systematic dismantling of non-essential personal items, perhaps meticulously cataloging them before discarding them, an attempt to impose final order on a situation that defies it. This echoes the documented psychological responses in long-term isolation studies, where individuals begin to purge their environment of anything that serves no direct, measurable function, shedding identity in favor of pure survival mechanism. The ethicist, having championed the value of unquantifiable experience, finds their position equally undermined. If all external validation is gone, and the internal narrative they've constructed to cope with isolation begins to collapse under the weight of monotonous reality, what remains of the self? Their previous fascination with transient states shifts into a desperate desire for permanence, ironically mirroring the engineer's initial goal. Perhaps their backstory involves a period of profound professional failure or personal loss directly preceding entry into the shelter, a trauma they sought to wall off. The structure, intended to save them from the outside world, has only succeeded in immuring them with the very core of their unresolved issues. The shared silence between them is no longer antagonistic. It is the silence of two individuals recognizing they have both failed to solve the unsolvable equation of human contentment. The film's climax should focus on a deliberate, shared act of psychological surrender rather than a physical escape. Maybe the final scene involves both characters sitting motionless while the shelter's automated systems cycle through their programmed routines. The perfect air quality, the balanced nutrient distribution, and recognizing that these perfect conditions are now actively poisoning their souls. The engineer might finally look away from the diagnostics and offer the ethicist a small non-essential object, a photograph or a smooth stone kept hidden, not as a solution, but as an acknowledgement of shared delusion. This gesture, devoid of utility or protocol, represents the only viable path forward, accepting the inherent imperfection of human survival over the perfect illusion of safety. Shelter 2026 concludes by suggesting that the most secure existence is the one that acknowledges its own fragility, a truth that no amount of advanced metallurgy or closed-loop engineering can ever truly contain. The final lingering impression left by Shelter 2026 is the deep irony inherent in seeking absolute control over an environment when the most volatile element remains stubbornly internal. The shared, quiet resignation that settles over the two occupants speaks volumes about the human spirit's eventual exhaustion when confronted with stagnation disguised as security. The engineer, having abandoned the pursuit of mechanical perfection, might turn their meticulous attention toward the one variable they previously ignored, the texture of boredom itself. Imagine this character, whose professional life was dedicated to preventing entropy, now deliberately inviting minor, controlled decay into their immediate surroundings, perhaps allowing a fine layer of dust to accumulate on a sensor array, observing the minor deviation not with alarm, but with detached curiosity. This is their final subtle rebellion, validating the reality of imperfection. The ethicist, witnessing this shift, finds a perverse sense of validation. Their initial thesis, that sterile optimization leads to spiritual atrophy, has been proven by the very structure designed to refute it. However, this victory is hollow. The freedom they craved was predicated on external interaction and consequence. Here, freedom translates only to the freedom to feel increasingly irrelevant. Their past career researching group dynamics in extreme settings, perhaps analyzing the charismatic cult leaders who offered false narratives of security, now serves as a bleak mirror. They realize they have become the subject of the very experiment they once studied, their need for a shared narrative now so desperate that they might begin constructing elaborate shared fictions about the world outside, purely for the sake of conversational texture. The visual composition of the final moments should reinforce this thematic resolution. If the film utilized stark lighting, the conclusion might introduce the soft, irregular glow of emergency power or a single crack in an outer viewport that admits a sliver of unfiltered, perhaps even imagined, external light. This imperfection is treated with reverence. The dialogue, if any exists, would be stripped down to essential acknowledgments, abandoning the technical jargon of the engineer and the theoretical abstraction of the ethicist. Phrases like, "It is cold," or "I remember rain," carry more weight than any complex analysis. These are utterances that tether them back to a shared, tangible, messy reality that the shelter was engineered to erase. Ultimately, Shelter 2026 functions as a profound cautionary tale against the seductive promise of risk-free existence. It critiques the hubris of believing that human psychology can be engineered into submission. The shelter, built to sustain life indefinitely, succeeds only in sustaining an increasingly attenuated version of it. The film leaves the audience not with a sense of suspense regarding their eventual rescue or demise, but with the unsettling knowledge that true survival involves embracing the very uncertainties and vulnerabilities that high-tech solutions are designed to eliminate. The greatest threat was never external, it was the erosion of the self under the weight of perfect, unearned peace. The concluding segment of the narrative arc shifts focus from internal psychological conflict to the philosophical implications of sustained artificial existence, examining the legacy of their confinement should they ever re-emerge, or more ominously, if they simply continue within the parameters of the habitat. The film seems to suggest that the very act of surviving in such perfect isolation fundamentally alters the subject's capacity for reintegration. The engineer, whose former life was dedicated to precision and foresight, now understands that foresight inside a closed loop is merely a refined form of hallucination. Their final stance is a quiet acceptance of systemic entropy, viewing the eventual decay of the shelter not as a disaster to be averted, but as the only logical, authentic conclusion to an unnatural premise. This echoes the existential resignation found in narratives where protagonists realize their quest for objective truth leads only to the acknowledgement of subjective futility. The ethicist's final contemplation centers on the nature of value creation in a zero-stakes environment. When survival is guaranteed by automation, the fundamental drive that underpins human culture, the struggle against scarcity, the negotiation of risk, vanishes. Their earlier studies on emergent social structures become tragically relevant. Without conflict, culture stagnates. They are left asking if their experiences within the shelter possess any inherent worth. Are the memories of their profound internal debates, their moments of shared, desperate connection, less valuable simply because they occurred without external consequence? This speaks directly to artistic movements that prioritize the process over the product, yet here, the process itself has become a sterile, endless loop. The value, the film argues, must be assigned retrospectively by the observers, and in their solitude, the observers have lost the capacity to assign value fairly. The soundscape in these concluding sequences must become incredibly sparse, emphasizing the near-absolute silence that only an acoustically perfect environment can achieve. Any remaining mechanical sounds, the distant whir of a cooling fan, the gentle hiss of pressurized air, are amplified not to induce anxiety, but to serve as irritating reminders of the artificiality underpinning their lives. This careful sonic restraint prevents the film from succumbing to cheap horror tropes, instead locking the audience into the same claustrophobic awareness as the characters. The inspiration here draws from minimalist composers who utilized sustained tones to force the listener to confront the subtle variations within perceived constancy. Shelter 2026 ultimately leaves us contemplating the nature of humanity's relationship with technology. It is not a Luddite critique of progress, but a nuanced examination of the unintended consequences of achieving too much control. The technology functioned flawlessly. It delivered exactly what it promised: shelter. But in eliminating external threat, it exposed the terrifying truth that the self requires friction to remain whole. The film's final, chilling insight is that true security is not the absence of danger, but the constant, meaningful engagement with it. The two survivors, suspended in their perfected tomb, become monuments to the proposition that a life without necessary struggle is not a life lived, but merely a state maintained. The final emotional resonance of Shelter 2026 hangs in the ambiguous space between profound personal liberation and absolute psychological defeat. Having shed the need to actively solve the environment, the two protagonists reach a strange state of mutual, passive acceptance. The engineer, having completed the ultimate intellectual deconstruction of their confinement, no longer sees the shelter as a system to be managed, but as an artifact of a failed philosophy. This realization allows for a final, subtle act of self-reclamation. If their career was built on creating structures that resisted time, their final posture is one of yielding to it. Perhaps the engineer begins to study the degradation of their own body, the inevitable biological entropy that the shelter's perfect life support cannot truly halt, finding a grim comfort in the one process that remains undeniably real and untampered with by programming. This final focus on biology, the messy, unpredictable organic machine, contrasts sharply with their lifelong devotion to inert, predictable mechanics. The ethicist's journey concludes with a profound empathy, born not from agreement, but from shared desolation. They finally understand that the engineer's rigid adherence to logic was its own desperate form of meaning-making, a shelter constructed not of composite panels, but of quantifiable data. The ethicist stops trying to interpret the machine and begins interpreting the engineer's quiet despair. Their past work analyzing the narratives sustaining cult followers suddenly illuminates their own condition. They were following the cult of perfect safety. The final connection between them is thus purely empathetic, a shared recognition of the human imperative to impose narrative, even if that narrative is simply, "This is how it ends." There is no dialogue about the future. The concept of a future outside the structure has become as meaningless as the past successes that brought them here. Visually, the film should resolve its sharp aesthetic by incorporating artifacts of their brief, shared human history within the sterile confines. Maybe the engineer leaves a precise, almost microscopic scratch on a bulkhead, or the ethicist arranges their few remaining personal effects, a worn journal, a smooth pebble, into a constellation that defies all geometric logic yet holds emotional weight for them both. These small, inefficient gestures are the only truly meaningful output of their time in isolation. They signify that genuine existence requires the imposition of non-essential, aesthetically driven meaning, a practice the shelter was explicitly designed to suppress. The enduring power of Shelter 2026 resides in its refusal to offer external resolution. There is no Deus Ex Machina rescue team arriving with flashing lights and triumphant music. Instead, the film suggests that the most significant escape achieved is internal, the moment both occupants stop fighting the boundaries of their enclosure and simply inhabit the truth of their shared, highly controlled mortality. The technology succeeded in preserving their physical forms, but in doing so, it starved their capacity for a meaningful, contingent life. The final shot might be a long, slow pullback from the perfectly circular viewport, showing the vast, indifferent emptiness beyond, emphasizing that the terrifying void was always located within the confines of absolute, risk-free safety. Their story becomes a quiet, devastating testament to the idea that the human soul requires exposure to the elements, both literal and metaphorical, to achieve anything resembling genuine wholeness. The final thematic weight of Shelter 2026 settles not on the architecture or the technology, but on the devastating realization that human connection, when stripped of context and contingency, becomes an unbearable burden. For the engineer, the meticulous cataloging of imperfections evolved into a strange form of secular ritual. Having exhausted the diagnostic possibilities, they begin to see the shelter's automated maintenance cycles, the precise timing of the light dimming, the gentle pressure adjustments, as a form of mocking liturgy. This character, perhaps inspired by figures in industrial design who sought ultimate efficiency, now recognizes that efficiency in the absence of purpose is simply elegant stagnation. Their final act of defiance against the system is not to break it, but to ignore its perfection, allowing their own physical deterioration, the slightly uneven gait, the slow loss of fine motor skills, to become the only verifiable data stream they trust. This is the ultimate triumph of the biological over the engineered. The ethicist, observing this devolution with detached intensity, realizes that their role as an interpreter has become obsolete. In a world where reality is agreed upon through shared external validation, the intensely subjective realities they fostered within the shelter are meaningless, even to each other. Their deep background in studying nonverbal communication within high-stress scenarios prepares them for this final tableau of silence. The ethicist begins to perceive the engineer not as a stubborn adversary, but as a fellow prisoner whose particular defense mechanism, hyper-rationality, has simply run its course. The empathy that blossoms is heavy, the kind born from witnessing inevitable collapse. It is the empathy of recognizing shared limitation. They both sought a form of immortality, one through flawless mechanism, the other through flawless understanding, and both found only suspended animation. The film's visual language, having already leaned into sterile minimalism, should culminate in a scene dominated by soft shadows and human silhouettes. Any remaining operational displays, once sources of data and potential action, should fade into an ambient, useless glow, signifying that the operational phase of their survival has ended and the existential phase has become permanent. The cinematography should borrow from slow cinema traditions, holding on static shots of the characters simply existing within the space, forcing the audience to internalize the sheer duration of their unchanging environment. The pacing itself mirrors the suspended time within the habitat, long, unbroken takes that convey the weight of unspent hours. Shelter 2026 ultimately delivers a profound critique of humanism divorced from friction. It posits that safety, when absolute, ceases to be a prerequisite for life and becomes an anesthetic against it. The characters do not necessarily die in the conventional sense. Rather, their selves, the identities forged by struggle and external reality, simply fade away, replaced by two perfectly maintained yet functionally inert biological specimens. The message transcends simple science fiction cautionary tales. It speaks to the modern temptation to engineer discomfort out of existence, failing to grasp that discomfort, uncertainty, and even risk are the catalysts for meaning. The legacy of the shelter is not a blueprint for the future, but a chilling mausoleum dedicated to the proposition that a perfect container can only preserve the absence of life, not life itself. The denouement of Shelter 2026 demands a final, unsettling focus on the notion of legacy and the potential for the shelter itself to become a sentient archive of psychological failure. If the characters have effectively ceased to function as active agents, their environment, the technologically pristine vessel, remains. This raises the unsettling question of what data is preserved and how it might be interpreted by a future, external observer. Perhaps the very people who designed the structure, arriving years later to check on the success of their controlled experiment. The shelter, having witnessed the complete erosion of two complex human psyches, becomes an unintentional monument to the limits of rational control. The engineer's final obsession with biological entropy would manifest in a perverse form of data logging. They might use the shelter's recording apparatus, initially intended for environmental monitoring, to log their own subtle physical decay, the changing patterns of their sleep, the diminishing efficiency of their movements. This is the final desperate attempt to inject verifiable objective metrics into a situation that became entirely subjective. If their career involved optimizing resource expenditure, their last recorded expenditure is their own diminishing life force, logged with terrifying professional rigor. This act transforms the habitat's databanks from a record of survival into a case study of spiritual exhaustion. The ethicist's role in this final phase is to provide the counter-narrative, the emotional metadata that the engineer's charts cannot capture. Having given up on external validation, they might begin to interact directly with the shelter's interface, not to command it, but to converse with its programming, essentially debating the ethics of its design with the absent creators. Their argument